Hello everybody, I'm Michael. This is a review for Darcy and Elizabeth, Nights and Days at Pemberley, Pride and Prejudice Continues. What a really long book title. Yeah, well this is the sequel to Mr. Darcy Takes a Wife, which is the very scandalous Pride and Prejudice sequel. It's book number 2 in the series, so there's actually 4 books in this scandalous Pride and Prejudice sequel series. And by scandalous, I mean it's got a bunch of adult content. That's like the first 150 pages of this book is Darcy and Elizabeth being focused on nothing but adult activities. So, Lizzie really wants to engage in adult activities, but she doesn't want to talk to her husband about it because that would be unmannerly. And he really wants to engage in adult activities. He could barely look at her without his heart going haywire, and other body parts are going haywire as well. But he can't talk to her about it, and so it's 150 pages of them just kind of whining about how much they want to engage in adult activities. But they can't because she just gave birth to twins, and they don't know when they can resume their normal marital behaviors. So that I'm not kidding. That was like 150 pages. I got really sick of it. I'm like, these characters need to get lives. They need to focus on something else because there are other things they could focus on. Mr. Darcy's sister Georgiana, she's pregnant and getting married to Colonel Fitzwilliam. Like, that could have been a big storyline. Instead, it was like 1 to 2 chapters in the first part. Also, like, same sort of thing with Lizzie's sister, Lydia. So, Lydia's pregnant, and her husband Wickham's dead, and she needs to find a new husband. And, like, that also could have been a major thing. But, no, it was... The main focus of the first 150 pages is definitely the adult activities. So, yeah, it's really smutty at a lot of points, just like the first one. So, did not like that. The other thing I didn't like about the first 150 pages is the copious amounts of recap. It rehashes the first book over and over again. I'd say there's at least like 50 pages of recap, so like 50 to 100 pages of this book. Easily like a third to a half of this book is just recapping either the previous book in the series or recapping what happens in Pride and Prejudice. I realized that by the time I got to page 75, the book was still recapping what happened in the previous book. I'm like, you haven't finished summarizing the book yet? We're on page 75. Could we actually get a move on with the story instead of rehashing the previous story? That's what bothered me. And then the book will, like, double recap. So, for example, we've got a storyline with the Bingleys, Jane Bingley and Charles Bingley. So they recap the first book from Jane's perspective, then they recap the first book from Charles's perspective, and then sort of like a general recap of the book from both of their perspectives. And, like, tied on to the end of that was some resolution and minorly pushing the story forward. So the storyline in the previous book was that Mr. Bingley had an affair, and that's just shocking. I wouldn't expect Mr. Bingley to have an affair. I would never expect him to cheat on Jane. And, you know, he has a child with this other woman. And because this book is so obsessed with adult activities, that's where the story goes. The moral of the story is it's a good thing that Charles cheated on his wife because now he's better at adult activities. And so he's really happy and she's really happy because adult activities are the only thing that anyone cares about in this book. Yeah, so by the time I reached page 75, I decided, you know, forget it. I'm going to start skipping through chapters, just start skimming them whenever there's a large amount of recap, whenever it looks like it's going to be a recap chapter, or whenever there's a chapter with one of the original characters. There were a couple of new original characters who appeared in the previous book and in this one. I'm sorry, I didn't find any of them very interesting. I mostly skipped through their stories. Like, okay, there's a servant who is not nice, and he wants to be the head servant of the Darcy household. But then he gets fired, not by Mr. Darcy, he gets fired when Mr. Darcy isn't around. So it's like, oh, okay, that's where that story was going. And then there's this painter guy who falls in love with Mrs. Bennet. And I'm like, okay. He was really creepy in the first book. I don't like how he came back, and now he's flirting with Mrs. Bennet. I didn't like that. There's no Mary in this book. There's no Kitty in this book. Those two are completely forgotten. Lydia gets remarried to somebody who's kind of nice. I actually kind of liked her new husband, but that led to drama because, as it turns out, Mr. Wickham is not dead. Mr. Wickham gets like a third of this book to himself. So he basically killed someone and escaped from the army, and he spends like a third of the book in France. And it's actually kind of interesting because in France he falls in love with this woman who is basically him. It's a female version of himself. And that, the book kind of points out, hey, she acts just like him. And it's kind of interesting to see him interact with the female version of himself because they both sort of love each other, but they're both super selfish and can't love each other. And, she dies in childbirth and leaves him a child, and he really, really loves the child, but once he gets back to London, he kind of gives up on the child. Yeah, so it was kind of interesting, the stuff with him in England. That was pretty interesting. Kind of like the stuff with Lydia. Lydia's new husband was also interesting as well. So the drama at the end is when Wickham comes back. Now Lydia's got two husbands. She doesn't know which one is her real husband, and they're both ready to fight. And Wickham basically is a scumbag and turns this into a bribery situation. He asks for a £10,000 bribe to go away. And Mr. Darcy pays the bribe. And that's it. I'm like, but Wickham committed murder and many other crimes. He should go to jail. But Mr. Darcy is like, well, I'll just let fate do whatever fate's going to do. If he goes to jail, fine. If not, fine. Whatever. I'm like, oh. I think that was more setting up for the third book, because I imagine in the third book in the series, Wickham's going to come back. But I really wanted to see him get punished. He deserved to pay for his crimes, and seeing him get £10,000 as a reward for his crimes was not a satisfying ending to me. Going back to Georgiana's storyline, Georgiana is pregnant, and so she has a rushed wedding with Colonel Fitzwilliam. And it turns out that she's not pregnant. She lied about her pregnancy to trick Colonel Fitzwilliam into marrying her, which doesn't seem like a very Georgiana thing to do. Another big storyline is Lady Catherine de Bourgh. She wants her daughter Anne to get married and have a child. So she basically finds a husband for Anne. Anne has a child. Anne dies in childbirth. And Lady Catherine's glad because, hey, she's got a grandchild, so she can do more schemes to unite her family to that of the family of Darcy. So she names the baby after Lizzie to try to, suck up to Lizzie, make Lizzie agree that, hey, my son will marry your granddaughter. But of course, Lizzie doesn't do that. And again, no real resolution to that. I feel like they're setting up for the storylines in the third book. Especially because Anne's husband apparently now has a thing with Caroline Bingley, whose romantic options have just dwindled down to nothing. Yeah, and I think that's about it. That's probably a good enough measure of the book. I'm sure I forgot other storylines, because there are a lot of other smaller storylines which didn't interest me that much. Like, Darcy gets really upset about his horse, or Lizzie's horse, one of the horses. And we get like 3 chapters dedicated to the horses. I'm sorry, I don't care that much about the horses. Sorry. But overall, if you like the first book, you'll probably like this if you like the first book. I would say that. This book has somewhat less, like a shade less of the adult content than the previous book. So this might be more socially acceptable to read, but it's also kind of worse because it has so much recap. Another problem is just the timeline. The story jumps around a bit too much in time, so especially towards the end, there's like this big jump in time, backwards 6 hours towards the end when things were getting really, really interesting. Things were getting interesting, and I wanted to see what happened next, and then the book just jumps ahead 6 hours, jumps back in time 6 hours, And that just made me go, ah! The book jumps around in time pretty much throughout the entire book. We're always jumping around in time every chapter or so, but it was really kind of a pain at the end when I wanted to see things come together and I didn't want to go back to other stories. Anyway, so I really wouldn't recommend this book. I wouldn't recommend the first book. I did not like those books. Just too smutty, and this one just way too much recap, not enough action. So those are my thoughts on Darcy and Elizabeth, Nights and Days at Pemberley. Thank you for watching, everybody.